With Apple, China had long delayed retaliating because they knew that that was one of their better cards that they had in their hand. And the Americans were applying these restrictions. China was acquiring technology. The conflict was heating up, but it was always a matter of time before they sanctioned Apple. I certainly expected it to happen eventually.
Will China extend its iPhone bans from government employees only to the entire nation for all Apple products? Obviously, this would have huge market implications. What will happen going forward to U.S.-Sino relations, and who is likely to win the 2024 U.S. elections at this point? We're here to discuss these issues with our next guest, Matt Gertken. He is a geopolitical strategist at BCA Research. Matt, good to see you. Always good to have you back.
Thank you, David. It's great to be back.
So China and the U.S. have been locked in a tech race for quite some time, and now with the release of the Huawei Mate 60 Pro, it seems like China is now catching up on the semiconductor front. The Mate 60 is now using an advanced semiconductor chip manufactured by SMIC, which is a Chinese manufacturer, not Qualcomm, an American company, or TSMC, the Taiwanese manufacturer of semiconductors. So what does this mean for U.S.-Chinese relations for the trade front? Let's start with that.
Okay, well, look, the intention of geopolitical analysis is to try to provide semi-permanent or permanent factors that we can base our analysis on, and then look at structural and cyclical factors as they develop over time. And only at the end do we look at the sort of tactical maneuvers that individual politicians are making, because those change from day to day. So we need to ground the analysis and try to avoid, partisanship and bias and things like that, right? So when we look at China, what we see is a country that is consolidating power at home in the mainland around the central government in Beijing and the Central Party to try to purge foreign influence and make sure that there will not be social, political dissent and disruption at home because of the economic transition the country is going through. They also want to acquire technology from abroad. So they're trying to purge foreign influence while also gain foreign technology, because that's how they're going to make the great leap forward, they believe, economically, in a context where they can no longer rely on manufacturing and construction. So if you put those two things together, the last bit is that then if they acquire that technology and they purge foreign influence, consolidate power in Greater China, they can then start to create a sphere of influence of their own in Asia. Obviously, the United States is trying to do opposite things, maintain technological supremacy and prevent them from forming a sphere of influence in Asia. And that's why we have this conflict. So the conflict is ongoing, and that's why we're going to see a whole series of U.S. Restrictions and then China evading and circumventing those restrictions.
I think part of the reason why there were sanctions on China to begin with, going back to the Trump administration, was to prevent the Chinese from acquiring this technology. Why do you think these sanctions may have failed? Obviously, they have now. Their chips are not as fine and perhaps as advanced as TSMC's chips yet, but they're getting there.
Well, it's possible that the Biden administration has allowed SMIC to provide chips and equipment and parts to Huawei. So that's one thing to think about. The Biden administration has been reaching out to China and trying to smooth over or stabilize relations, or let's just say not have anything blow up ahead of the election next year. So I think that is one element of the discussion. But if China is simply evading, then we'll know very soon, because the U.S. will retaliate forcefully, because that would then, of course, knock down or destroy the credibility of the American export controls and sanctions, and the Biden administration would be forced to do something about that. So we'll find that out soon enough. The issue is that Biden is trying to draw a distinction between de-risking and taking actions that protect U.S. national security and prevent China from gaining the most advanced military capabilities, but then also, not decoupling. What he says is he wants the two economies to continue to trade and invest and integrate in other areas. Now, that sort of sounds like having your cake and eating it too, because from the Chinese perspective, if you can imagine, if the U.S. can entirely de-risk, then that's a phase in which the U.S. would then have the capability of decoupling, which would leave China in the vulnerable position. So, I think that what we'll say is that the China's too big to be contained, and U.S. sanctions are not going to be effective in preventing China from making some key technological breakthroughs. They won't be able to catch up in semiconductors in the most advanced chips anytime soon. but they are certainly going to try, and they will deliver surprises to the world.
Okay, so here's a response from Republican House Representative Mike Gallagher. He said that this chip likely could not be produced without U.S. technology, and thus SMIC may have violated the Department of Commerce's foreign direct product rule. The time has come to end all U.S. technology exports to both Huawei and SMIC. To make clear, any firm that flouts U.S. law and undermines our national security will be cut off from our technology. Okay, so first of all, is this the appropriate response to what happened? And second, if this were to pass, which is that a complete ban of U.S. technology to Huawei and SMIC were to happen, what would be the likely Chinese response?
So the president controls foreign policy. That's fundamental to U.S. Government system. And what we'll see here is tension between the House Republicans. They are a hawkish party on China since the Trump administration, and of course the Biden administration has co-opted that approach. The United States, again, from a strategic point of view, is trying to contain China, but the Republicans in the House don't have to worry about balancing the different interests and the different risks, so they can push a very hawkish line. The Biden administration will not necessarily listen to the House. I mean, first of all, they don't have to. There's not a unified Congress. And second of all, again, the president controls foreign policy. So the president can decide how to retaliate or whether to retaliate. And that timing may very well depend on the election. The president might come back with a minimal response. And lo and behold, in 2025, if he's reelected, he could come back with a sledgehammer. And that's one thing that China is very well aware of. China knows that the Biden administration is reaching out today, trying to engage in various diplomatic discussions, trying to restart military talks. But China also knows that if Biden's reelected, then the whole tune is going to change yet again. And that's one reason why China doesn't have a major interest in offering concrete concessions. And instead, they're pushing forward on developing their own capabilities as rapidly as they can.
The ban on iPhones for Chinese government workers is worrying actually citizens as well. I'm just reading this article from today. A growing ban on iPhones among Chinese state enterprises has office workers worried their employers might start jumping on an anti-Apple bandwagon. First of all, before that happens, why has this happened so far? Why is the government instituting certain restrictions on iPhone usage?
Well, so the Americans have imposed sanctions and export controls on Huawei and on semiconductor equipment. They're working with Japan and the Netherlands and others to create a containment coalition. The only reason why Taiwan and South Korea are not preventing China from getting access to critical semiconductor parts and equipment is because the Biden administration has given them a waiver, and that waiver expires in October next year. Basically, the U.S. is building this containment coalition, and China's, again, they're going to be trying to evade that in every way they can and breach that cordon and prevent it from strangling their technology and modernization. So that's just a fundamental, part of this relationship. Now, with Apple, China had long delayed retaliating because they knew that that was one of their better cards that they had in their hand. And the Americans were applying these restrictions. China was acquiring technology. The conflict was heating up, but it was always a matter of time before they sanctioned Apple. I certainly expected it to happen eventually. Now we've got to that point, and what it suggests is a couple of things. First, the Biden administration's outreach this year has not been effective, very clearly. Second of all, China's well aware of the difference in the election and the sort of the power cycles. Xi Jinping consolidated power in October. Joe Biden has an election next year, right? So Joe Biden's the one at the disadvantage here. China can actually push its case and try to get concessions out of the U.S. And finally, the end game here is going to be the Taiwanese election in January and the U.S. election in November, because that's going to create the new policy settings. And in 2025, we'll find out whether China believes that they'll still have access to the equipment they need to modernize their economy.
Yeah, we're going to come back to the elections, but just on what you just said earlier, you expect down the line China to sanction Apple. Can you expand on that word? What do you mean by sanction?
Well, they definitely can. I mean, the way that you start with these sort of initiatives or measures is with government employees, public employees, because what you're sort of signaling is that this is an area where you know that you'll gain compliance. It's also a warning sign. It's not the entire economy. And it's also a national security issue. If you think about from the point of view of the different countries, look, the first thing we have to do is make sure that our government isn't operating on equipment or instruments provided by other countries, right? So the U.S. will do the same thing there and make sure that Huawei is not, providing hardware to the U.S. and vice versa. So this has been brewing from that point of view, and I think, of course, it's devastating for Apple's business line. And what we know is that the U.S. companies are going to be pushing very hard for the U.S. government to take things more slowly. And what I'm saying is, we knew all this. The change now is that Biden is the one on the back foot because he has an election. So he has to try to prevent the floor from falling out of the U.S.-China relationship and U.S. corporations panicking and withdrawing investment, because it would ultimately hurt his reelection odds, even if it does, in fact, pursue the national security objectives that he ultimately does want to pursue.
Well, China is a huge market for Apple, not just for iPhones, but all their products. And we know that iPhones are already starting to lose market share to Huawei. Add sanctions on top of that, and Apple stands to lose a lot. Their valuations would really take a hit and potentially drag down the entire market index with it. But right now, as we're speaking today on Tuesday, the markets don't seem to reflect that expectation that sanctions will come from China. Why is this not being reflected yet?
Yeah, well, the markets are, of course, responding to a whole ocean of data, right? And what we've seen this year in particular is that geopolitics is not generally moving the markets. Last year, there was a big geopolitical shock, bear market. Markets bounced back this year. The focus is on inflation and the central banks. And markets are really just not wanting to pay attention to geopolitics. Now, what that does is it creates a risk. It means it's a mispricing. It means that we can see in front of us the evidence that decoupling is proceeding, even though the Biden administration has been trying to massage with this new language about de-risking. And as that information percolates, eventually there will be an incident that will cause the derating of exposed assets like Apple. And so this is just something we'll have to continue to be prepared for going forward. And what it suggests, I think, most importantly, is that the U.S.-China deterioration is a systemic issue. And it's one that the market can only ignore for so long before the next shoe drops. And then that fear factor returns. And that fear factor is going to affect U.S. equities that are exposed to China. But as we see, it is being priced in investable Chinese equities, which, of course, have done very poorly all year.
Okay. So let's talk about U.S.-Chinese relations going forward. Do you think that perhaps a softening of relations or perhaps détente altogether would be a priority for the next administration, whether it be a Democrat or Republican win?
Well, détente is a reduction of tensions, is something that eventually can happen, but we don't have the evidence for it coming together. And I think the key point there is, if you look at the Cold War, which is the analogy for détente and for the U.S.-China competition, notwithstanding large differences, the periods of détente followed periods of enormous crises, periods in which it looked as if the U.S. and the Soviet Union were about to go to war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, or the Berlin block, airlift, or periods of enormous uncertainty regarding the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. These are things that caused fright, and then caused the policymakers to essentially recognize their interests and decide, well, we need to get together and reduce the level of tensions out of our own interest. And what we have not seen between the U.S. and China is that development yet. You could argue it's happening. People are arguing it's happening because Biden needs to get reelected, and Xi Jinping has a slowing economy that's very troubled with the property meltdown. But the problem is that Biden might not be around very long. What happens if the election, which is not low probability that the Republicans come back into power, and the current Republican Party is a Trumpist Republican Party, likely to pursue that hawkish policy on China that we talked about earlier with Mike Gallagher. So China has to be prepared for all the outcomes, and in particular, they have to be prepared for the worst outcomes. They have to be prepared for Biden to get reelected and then pursue a much more aggressive containment strategy, or they have to be prepared for President Trump to come back. And what that does is it puts a limit on the extent to which the two can trust each other for now. If the Biden administration has staying power, then in 2025, 2026, perhaps we will see a more significant strategic negotiation, perhaps. But, it's really too early.
You bring up an interesting point, which is that either a Biden win or a Trump win would mean a second term for either of these presidents. Can you just explain the logic here? Why is it that a second term presidency would generally mean more hawkish rhetoric towards China?
Yeah, and not just rhetoric, a more hawkish policy. And this is something that I think, again, differentiates the political commentary you hear other places, often partisan in nature, with the geopolitical approach, which doesn't really, it tries to be clinical, avoid partisanship. What we're looking at is a structural feature. U.S. presidents have 2 terms. The second term, they can't get reelected, which means that they can take larger risks. Now, that could be in any areas. So, for example, we could see President Biden pursue a more aggressive climate agenda in his second term. But the point is that when Congress is not controlled, and that's very likely to be the case with Biden in particular, the Democrats don't have a great prospect of winning back Congress and the White House in 2024. So if Biden's reelected, his hands are tied at home. That's where he would have the ability to use the presidential powers abroad. And worst case scenario, it hurts the economy. Well, that would hurt the Democratic Party. They don't necessarily want him to do that. But at that stage, Biden's worried about his legacy. He's worried about going down in history as an American president who defended U.S. interests. And that's the same phenomenon with President Trump. These are also very old men. They're going to be in their 80s. So they're not only at the end of their terms in office, they're at the end of their lives. This is an environment where they could make visionary or apocalyptic or radical decisions, revisionary decisions. And that's going to cause more disruption for the financial markets, as opposed to a first-term leader who's younger, has a whole career ahead of them, wants to get reelected, and does need to pay attention to whether they hurt the economy in their first term.
Let's talk about Taiwan very briefly. The cornerstone of U.S.-China relations is the recognition of the One China policy. Now, with China developing their own advanced chips, my question is, why is Taiwan still of strategic importance? Now, keep in mind, up until now, TSMC, the Taiwan semi-manufacturing company, has basically monopolized the semi-industry worldwide. I think as of fourth quarter 2022, their market share was 58.5% of the global semi market. Now, if the Chinese do catch up eventually, is Taiwan still important to either side?
Well, great question. So we talked earlier about how what China's trying to do is, expel foreign influence, acquire technology, and build a sphere of influence. Now, Taiwan is a thorn in their side from this perspective. I mean, first of all, obviously, Taiwan has adopted democratic governance and is cooperating with the United States military all these 70 plus years. And this has always been a very, grievous sore for the Communist Party because it challenges their legitimacy. And it's not just about politics, it's also about strategy. I mean, if a foreign navy is based in Taiwan, that's a navy that can threaten the ports of southern China and much of the wealth and stability and security of southern China. So this is simply an intolerable national security situation from China's point of view. And they've always said that. They just haven't always had the capability to do anything about it. In recent decades, they're gradually gaining the capability someday to do something about it. And then meanwhile, the semiconductors are an important element of that. And what we're specifically looking at is the way in which the U.S. is trying to control China's access to semiconductors. And Taiwan would then be asked to enforce U.S. law against China. Now, that's simply unacceptable from Beijing's point of view. They can't allow what they see as a province to enforce American law that strategically limits their own technological progress. It's geopolitically unacceptable. So China will first try to break through that arrangement with every means they can use, diplomatically, politically. Then they'll use economic pressure, ultimately leading up to an embargo. But if all options are exhausted, military option, of course, is one that they've always said they would use. So the Taiwan election is important because it's a question of whether they will enforce U.S. law. And then the U.S. election is important as to whether the U.S. will issue waivers to allow Taiwan to keep working with the Chinese on semiconductors. But it is a much bigger issue than just semiconductors.
So can we extend this analysis to say that suppose we completely remove semiconductors out of the equation, would Xi Jinping still prioritize reunification?
Yes, because yes, ultimately, because first of all, if there is a conflict, the semiconductor, it's not as if he can invade Taiwan and maintain perfectly functioning, fabs to produce advanced chips. That won't work that way. And that's one of the main reasons not to invade, right? If what China wants is to increase its technology and advance among the ranks of nations and be able ultimately to hold its own against the United States and in the region, then it doesn't want to destroy these advanced semiconductors fabs in Taiwan. It wants to absorb them. And that's the objective. Only when it's clear that they don't have that option would China have to resort to military options. And that's why these decisions over the coming years are so important. Now, from the American point of view, what the Biden administration is trying to do is calibrate the increase of tension, saying, look, we're pursuing a containment strategy, but China has the option of calling the whole thing off by opening up market access and reducing some of its aggressive technological acquisition and pursuing a more cooperative and sort of Western friendly policy. Now, the problem is the ship already sailed on all that, right? And China's also partnering with Russia. Russia's weak. The U.S. now knows it cannot divide those two. So the U.S. is going to pursue a containment policy almost no matter what China does because of the fear of a Russo-Chinese alliance, and China's aware of that. So unfortunately, we're in this negative spiral, this vicious circle of relations, and the only way out would be massive reforms in China, a huge pivot by Xi Jinping, or a leadership change in the U.S. in which the U.S. maybe becomes less inclined to defend its interests in the Pacific. But I would even warn you that if that happens, China would see it as an opportunity to be more belligerent. So it's hard to get out of this geopolitical sort of enigma we have.
Okay, on that note, Biden has said that should military tensions escalate to the point where China uses force against Taiwan, America would defend Taiwan. Was that just a bluff from Biden?
No, the three Taiwan Strait crises prior to the one over the past few years, the U.S. sent aircraft carriers in the Taiwan Strait, which was a very physical symbol of the American intention to defend the island. And that goes back to the point I made, which it's not about semiconductors. That's a factor. It's really about strategic security in the region, the sea lines of communication between the countries. Will Japan feel comfortable if China can conquer Taiwan and basically have a veto over Japan's food and fuel imports? No. Will Japan then consider nuclear armament? Yes. Will South Korea be comfortable if Japan and China are nuclear and North Korea? No. Basically what you see is the whole security architecture of the region starts to unravel, and the Americans lose the ability to be the arbiter of the region because they've lost the linchpin, which is Taiwan.
Now let's turn to the elections for the U.S. next year. What do you think are the priorities for either party? What's on their agenda? What's on their platforms that people should be looking out for?
Well, continuing our conversation about the structure of U.S. politics, I mean, first and foremost, the presidency is about foreign policy because if Congress is divided, it's not about domestic policy. They can do executive orders, but then they have to clash with the courts. Basically their hands are tied unless they win the whole, trifecta. I think that the Republicans are not favored, and I've said that on your show before. I think that's clear because of the power of the incumbency and because the economy has surprised to the upside, so the recession risk has been reduced. However, we're dealing in a world of probabilities. If the incumbency effect is reduced, like if President Biden gets sick or he's too old or he has to step down, that would reduce the incumbency effect and it would hurt Democrats' odds. If the economy slips into recession, it would be devastating for Democratic odds, right? So there's things that can change over the 14-month period. But as things stand, incumbency and the economy are powerful. When we look at foreign policy, there's a series of crises that can occur. They would have to produce a humiliation that discredits the Democratic Party in order for Republicans to win. Because if it's just a confrontation from abroad, the American people will tend to rally around the existing administration. And finally, social issues are, at an extreme pitch of polarization in the U.S., but a lot of the popular opinion leans toward the Democrats on the salient social issues. And so that doesn't really change things. So basically, the Republicans are dependent on the economy, and if there's a recession, that's going to be the factor that would discredit the Democrats, or some kind of foreign policy defeat. Those are the only factors that would really change this election.
Okay, just on that note, I'm gonna play you a quick clip of President Biden making a speech about a week and a half ago, almost 2 weeks ago, on the jobs market, and I'd just like to get your reaction to this.
Look at where we are now. Just this morning, we learned that the economy created 190,000 jobs last month. All told, we've added 13.5 million jobs since I took office. Around 800,000 of them manufacturing jobs. We created more jobs in 2 years than any president ever created in a single four-year term. We did in 2 years. What's more, when I took office, the unemployment rate was 6.3%. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office predicted that it would not get below 4% until the end of 2025. Now, the unemployment rate has been below 14% for the last 19 months, the longest stretch in over 50 years. We've recovered all the jobs lost during the pandemic. We've added 1 million more new jobs. More than 700,000 people joined the labor force last month, which means the highest share of working-age Americans are in the workforce now than at any time in the past 20 years.
Okay, is that true that his administration did indeed improve the labor market conditions of the U.S. over the last 2 years?
Well, I mean, obviously, we're talking about a period where we went from the pandemic, in which we had massive layoffs and a total shutdown of the economy, to a sort of return to normal. So yeah, it's true that the unemployment rate fell drastically, and it has been a very strong and, let's say, a tight labor market, because the Democratic Party spent a total of $5 trillion stimulating the U.S. economy. The U.S. spent 25% of GDP stimulating during the height of the pandemic, which was in excess of any other country. And then ultimately you had the Biden administration apply even more support through the Inflation Reduction Act, which was, of course, woefully misnamed, but it was a measure that targeted, in particular, like climate change, and enabled subsidies for renewable energy. So these are all factors that have been, investing in the U.S. economy. And the question, though, is now we're seeing the waning of that stimulus. We had a big drop in stimulus. We had the sort of fiscal contraction last year, and that was a major factor in the fear of recession. Now we've bounced back. The problem is we've got tight monetary policy. We see that real income and real wage are rolling over after having bounced back. We see that consumer confidence is still very weak, and we have 14 months to go. The unemployment rate did tick up a little bit. I think the jury's still out on the reasons for that, but restrictive monetary policy tends to cause recessions. So this is an administration that they can sort of show the good numbers now. The problem is, over the 14 months, the economy will probably slow, and then it's a question of whether it goes into outright recession. If it's a recession, they're in dire condition for the reelection. If it's just a slow growing economy, though, they would still be favored.
So are you saying that right now, as of today, we're filming in mid-September, the conditions still favor a Democrat win next year?
Oh, yeah, of course they do. Again, you're talking about an incumbent president. Incumbent presidents win 67% of the time in U.S. history. And then second of all, you're talking about a non-recessionary economy. The data this year have all moved against recession, or pushing out the looming recession. And if that is pushed out until 2025, then this is an administration that's going to waltz to re-election, no matter how old the president is. People fail to point out that he was old in 2020, and he was often incoherent in 2020. What mattered were the conditions. In 2020, we had a pandemic, social unrest, and recession. That kicked out the incumbent party. In 2024, if we don't have a recession and we don't have a pandemic, and instead what we've got is just sort of a slow growing economy, that's not enough to kick out the incumbent party.
Well, do you see any other candidates in the Republican Party Democrat Party rather, that could challenge Biden as a frontrunner?
No, he's got a 40 percentage point lead ahead of his nearest competitor, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is more of a sort of gadfly. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is not doing well in the in the primary election polling, and there isn't really a primary election to speak of because of the same factor I told you, which is the Democratic Party doesn't want a primary election. It would, if it were a competitive one, it would reduce the odds that they would win the White House. So they're going to go with the incumbent president, and they would also stick with the vice president, Kamala Harris, who is criticized for various reasons, but in fact is better situated than anyone else other than President Biden. And these are the mechanics of U.S. politics. It has nothing really to do with the personalities. Obviously, they could make terrible mistakes, or they could get sick, or wild things could happen over the 14 months. But our probabilities are going to strongly favor Biden over anyone else, Harris over anyone other than Biden. And then if neither of them, if something happens and neither of them are the candidate, that would then start to favor the Republican Party, because essentially the Democrats have abandoned their own ticket.
On the Republican side, Trump is leading right now. He's facing a number of lawsuits. In October, he's going to face a civil lawsuit regarding allegedly fraudulently overvaluing the Trump organization's valuations and assets. He's also facing another civil suit by E. Jean Carroll. Will any of these impact his popularity?
No, and we argued that they wouldn't, and they haven't, right? And this is all news now. And in fact, what we saw was that the reaction was the opposite. Voters, particularly Republican voters, increased their support for President Trump after the indictments. So that has already happened. That's rearview mirror. I think the one issue you could raise now, though, is that he does have to contend in a primary election, right? Beginning January 15th in Iowa. And so what that says is, there could be surprises. There could be a situation where Florida Governor Ron DeSantis gives him a bigger challenge than people are expecting now, because everyone has written off DeSantis. And yet Trump does actually have to compete. So it's not like the debates where he can just skip the process. He's skipping the Republican debates, and that's worked well for him. But when we get into the new year, it is conceivable that there will be a change in momentum for one of the other candidates. And that would, if it happened in the first 2 months, it could then change the whole game. I think that's a very low probability, to be clear, because I think I've argued since March 2021 that Trump would be the candidate, but I'm just saying, it can happen. And by the way, if Trump locks it down seamlessly, which is what the polling currently suggests, then he's also has a little bit better of a probability against Biden, because it means that the party is fairly unified around him.
Is there any significant probability of Trump going to jail before November next year?
I think it's a political issue rather than a legal issue. So there is some probability. But the reason I say that is because the support that President Trump gets will make it hard for the legal process to run its full course and result in a conviction ahead of time. Conviction itself will be hard. You've got to find 12 jury members who unanimously agree. But that certainly could happen. In the case of the documents that were kept from the National Archives, there's photographs, right? So there's sort of it's going to be hard for the defense in that case. The other issue is in Washington, D.C., over 90% of the population voted for Biden. So maybe that's a place where you could get 12 jurors to unanimously agree. Bottom line, I wouldn't rule it out. What I would say, though, is that if Trump is imprisoned, that increases the odds of Republicans winning the general election. Because what it does is it solves the Republican Party's problem. The Republican Party's problem is they've got a division over the Trumpists and the never-Trumpers, and they can't unify around a new candidate because President Trump's not going to withdraw from the race. And President Trump could run as a third-party candidate and destroy the Republican bid. But if he's put in jail, now Trump needs to endorse a new Republican, and now the Republicans are all unified and angry. And the candidate they're going to put forward is younger, someone who's fresh and young and different, and that would be more competitive against Biden as well. So basically, if it happens, it increases Republican odds substantially.
Finally, either a Democrat win or Republican win, would either party significantly change their fiscal priorities going forward?
Yes, I do think fiscal matters, but like we've talked about, it depends on Congress. And in particular, Democrats are not as likely to win a full sweep. They won a full sweep in 2020. It would be surprising if they won back the House and the Senate and the White House in 2024. Could happen, but as we've discussed, Biden has a low approval rating and the economy has restrictive monetary policy and likely to be slowing down into the election. So not likely to win a full sweep for Democrats. That means gridlock, and that means that fiscal policy is basically sort of flat. It doesn't have a dramatic impact. On the Republican side, you would have to have a big shock, like we discussed, a recession or some kind of foreign policy disaster. If that happens and it puts the Republicans in power, then they very well could win all of Congress and the White House. And in that case, they could pass significant legislation that would move the needle on fiscal policy. What would they do? That's important to ask. What we've seen is that the Trumpist Republican Party has been unwilling to tighten the budget. They have not been fiscal hawks. They have not been budget disciplinarians, not at all. And in fact, the shift in the party has been more in the Trump direction, which is we need to keep entitlements in place because we're going for these elderly voters. And so from that perspective, you could have some trimming and discretionary spending, but you're not going to have a massive overhaul of the long-term U.S. fiscal trajectory. And that means that by and large, we're dealing with a populist world. We're dealing with two political parties that don't want to cut spending. And that's a macroeconomic factor of the next 4 years at least.
Just one more point before we finish off. Do you see any possibility of a central bank digital currency, a CBDC, a Fed coin being implemented in the next administration? I know it's not a major platform issue, but certainly it's been talked about a lot in the financial press. What are your takes on this?
I don't have any particular insight on the timing. I think that we have seen an evolution in human history from cows to bones to metal to paper. We've had this whole development in the forms of money. Digital money makes a lot of sense given the amount of time that people spend their lives and the ease of transactions that can be done across borders. So, there's a case for digital currency. I think that the case, it's also very well known, and I think it's become more realized over the past year. I've been writing about this for several years. Governments fought very hard to get control of the printing press and to control the money supply. And the reason for that, historically, for a long time, has always been that they do not want an ailing economy to throw them out of power. So the rulers will attempt to expand the money supply in order to quicken the economy. It's a basic fact. And in modern nation states, gain control of the printing press for that reason. Well, what it means is that cryptocurrencies can introduce new risks. On the one hand, they could provide more liquidity, but on the other hand, that could get out of control. It could create booms and busts. It could create systemic risk. It could jeopardize financial institutions. Banks may not be necessary anymore if blockchain is wildly successful. There's all kinds of futures we can imagine. I think the end game is that the central governments in powerful states will attempt to control the money supply. And I think they'll be quite effective at doing that. So cryptocurrencies, it depends on what these assets are, but insofar as they are money, they may have to be based in minor countries or countries that are not subject to that sort of imperial control that we'll see in the major powers.
Excellent. Well, Matt, excellent analysis as always. I appreciate your time. Where can people learn more from you and also from BCA?
BCA Research, Geopolitical Strategy and U.S. Political Strategy. Will be covering all these events blow by blow over the next 18 months, and it will be a very, very busy cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I look forward to following up with you as more news comes out of the politics and geopolitics arena. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.